Maybe you watched the last episode about avoiding attachment and screamed, "Oh my god, yes, this is so me." Well, below another YouTube video about avoiding attachment, I read someone commenting, "You absolutely nailed what it is like for someone with an avoidant attachment style. Please also make clear that avoidant attachment style is a relational and emotional wound that can be healed and managed. Attachment wounds are not determined like the Myers-Briggs. People need to understand, oh gosh, no wonder I find it so difficult to trust other people. This is something that I need to work on so that I can live a more fulfilling life." Let's do this together. Here are 5 ways to work through and manage an avoidant attachment style. Here we go. Welcome to today's episode. My name is Robert, and this video is based on my own experience, research, and therapy work. I'm not a healthcare professional myself. Instead, I share a client's perspective here on this channel, and I recently also started an online community for people like us who deal with childhood trauma. And in that community, I share everything that I learned while working with 3 different therapists on trauma and attachment wounds, and put that into more than 30 video courses and practical exercises from therapy. So a guided step-by-step path that you can follow along as well to resolve and avoid an attachment style and many other trauma-related symptoms. You can join the platform right now at understandable.net/join and get access today. And regarding that episode today, this video here, healing and avoiding attachment style and working through the symptoms. This is the second one of a 4 double-part series on attachment style. So the second one of 8 videos in total. So in the past episode, the first one, we talked about 10 signs that you might have an avoidant attachment style, and to cope with that style is what we talk about today. In the next 2 episodes, we are going to talk about 10 signs of an anxious attachment style and how to manage that one. Then in the third double episode, I will reveal 10 signs that you might have a fearful avoidant or disorganized chaotic attachment style, often also mistyped as avoidant or anxious attachment. And afterwards, we are also talking about solutions and approaches for that style. In the last 2 episodes of this series, we are talking about all the lucky ones who might have a secure attachment style. And we also talk about how securely attached people can help insecurely attached people to heal. And to get a broader overview of all the 4 attachment styles, I definitely recommend you watching our episode on complex trauma and the 4 attachment styles. And I will link all the videos in the description below every episode of the series, and you find them as well in the attachment style playlist here on this channel. While classic couples counseling will not be on this list today of 5 ways how to work through an avoidant attachment style. Well, conventional therapy like couples counseling is, in my opinion, not a favorable approach for working through avoiding attachment patterns. Why do I believe that? Well, in couples counseling, some therapists may encourage the avoidant part to give the anxiously attached counterpart more attention and care, which they request so often out of their anxious attachment wounds. And they also might encourage the anxious part to give the avoidant one more space and holding back, which is also a typical symptom of the avoidant attachment style, as we saw in the last episode. And this leads both parts to trigger each other less, of course, which is at first sight a good thing, but neither of them actually does any healing or resolving here of their attachment wounds. And that's because the approach tries to solve things on a behavioral level, not on the depth psychological level. And therefore, I researched some other approaches that I found more appealing and tried myself for people with an avoidant attachment style. And let's start with approach number 1 here, which is working with the avoidant inner child. What that is, maybe you came across the term of inner child's work already. Inner child's work goes back to the work of Carl Gustav Jung's concept of the child's archetype, but it's also involved in the work of Eric Berne and John Bradshaw, for example. And the attachment theory and development psychology are also a bright field where the inner child is a topic in. Especially Bradshaw emphasizes how childhood trauma, attachment wounds, and unmet emotional needs can manifest as dysfunctional behaviors in childhood. And for a person with an avoidant attachment style, the work with the inner child usually focuses on the following wounds, which are highly present in an avoidant child. For example, rejection and emotional wounds. So if a child learned that expressing emotions led to dismissal, ridicule, or neglect, they start to suppress emotions and rely solely on themselves, believing emotional vulnerability is unsafe. Also, the wound of the belief in unworthiness of love. So if a caregiver's emotional distance or conditional love taught the child that they must earn love to be accepted, then the avoidant inner child internalizes feeling of being unlovable, which leads to chronic self-reliance and emotional detachment in the future, and as well the wound of fear of intimacy, which is so typical for avoidant people. So if emotional neglect, boundary violations, or manipulative behavior by caregivers created discomfort with closeness, then the inner child associates intimacy with fear, a loss of control, or entrapment, making connection feel threatening. And therefore, there are multiple steps here that you can go to work with your inner child as an avoidantly attached person. Number one is, from my experience, to first of all recognize the inner child. And there is a lot of literature on that in all language possible that explain the concept of the inner child. So if that concept is new to you, I definitely encourage you to go through that first step. That's important for everyone who is not yet aware of their inner child. And what's important here is to understand that emotional avoidance is a protective mechanism formed in childhood. So it's a mechanism from your inner child, of course, in the concept of the inner child's work. Number two is to acknowledge suppressed emotions. It's important to understand here and to recognize that which emotions did you suppress since your childhood. Maybe vulnerable emotions, for example, right? And to do so, you can create a safe space here to identify and validate feelings like, for example, fear, sadness, or the need for closeness that you actually have deep down, but which never came to light. Number three is to reparent the inner child. You can ask yourself what the child needs after recognition. What is that for you? Is that comfort? Is that love? Is that compassion? And the things your avoidant inner child usually didn't receive are the things that you need to put effort in now, that you need to recognize, that you need to give to the inner child. And you can do that by, for example, using affirmations. For example, you are safe with me. You are safe right now in the environment. You can also use visualizations here. I love to use my journal as well to write those affirmations down. Or I use the Notes app in my phone quite often, where I just put sometimes, and that's really helpful, just those tiny things, put down. When you know that there is a potential triggering situation, write down, I'm safe now. I'm a grown-up being now. And if your inner child is there, protect me, then say, I'm there for you now, and really feel that. Number four is to build emotional awareness. And I always say that here on the channel, you have to learn to create awareness for your emotions. And especially important here is to tune into your inner child's emotions, to identify what the inner child is feeling and practice those emotions, to express those emotions safely. You can also use the emotion wheel I always have here by my side. Yes, that's really helpful. And you can download that for free, of course, in our workbook. You find on our website, understandable.net. On the last page, we have that in the free workbook as a download, so you can practice which emotions maybe are hidden for you and which emotions you already express on a daily basis. Number 5 is to release shame around dependency. That's important for an avoidant inner child. Now, this step is also quite difficult. That's because toxic shame is a topic for most of the childhood trauma survivors, I think for all of them. And it's also because the inner child feels a lot of shame in that concept. And this is why, for example, in our pyramid, which you also find on our website, I have this model of a pyramid where I explain step by step how to work through trauma symptoms. And toxic shame, this one is at level 5 of the pyramid, so it's really high up, and that's because it's pretty hard to resolve. What you need in order to break free from toxic shame potentially is to reframe that needing others is a natural and healthy thing and a part of healthy relationships and not a sign of weakness, what the inner child at the moment might think still. And number 6 in inner child's work is to practice vulnerability. And that's extremely important for people with an avoidant attachment style. You can start to gradually share feelings, needs, boundaries, show yourself vulnerable in safe relationships while reassuring the inner child. You need safe relationships for that, definitely, that's for sure. But since I do that in my relationships to show myself more vulnerable, it's definitely improving mild childhood trauma symptoms. And we also have a course on our platform on how to find the right people for safe relationships if that's not coming intuitively to you. It's another point definitely on the pyramid model here. Let's talk about approach number 2 to work through an avoidant attachment style, and that is shadow work. Shadow work means integrating your avoidant wounds. And shadow work originates also from Carl Gustav Jung's work, and it's an exploration and integration of unconscious. Unconscious means repressed and hidden parts of ourselves. Shadow work also often helps with repressed emotions that are often emotions such as fear, also desires. And the goal of shadow work is always to achieve personal growth here and to grow out of your childhood wounds. There are a few very significant hidden parts of an avoidantly attached person that they usually or quite often keep in their shadow, and those are, for example, number 1, repressed emotional needs. Those mainly include a deep longing for emotional closeness and connection that then leads to self-sufficiency and emotional disconnection. Also the fear of vulnerability here. So that's the fear of being seen, of being judged, or being hurt when emotionally opening to other people. That's often also hidden, which then usually results in a difficulty to form deep connection and a tendency to withdraw when relationships become too intimate. Maybe it sounds familiar to you. To me, it does. And number 3 is buried shame here. That's another thing in the shadow of avoidantly attached people. And buried shame, again, that's a core belief of being flawed, of being unworthy or not good enough. And usually in adult life, toxic shame drives things such as perfectionism, but also judgment of others, of ourselves, and avoidance of situations where the perceived flaws of a person might be exposed. And in case you want to deep dive more into toxic shame, I also recently created an episode on that, which I will link to you up here and in the description below, of course. Let's talk about how we can use shadow work to heal the hidden aspects of an avoidant shadow. What are the exact steps here? Well, same as for the inner child. Let's go through a couple steps. Number 1 is definitely the readiness for change. And that sounds so obvious, but for an avoidantly attached person is often not. You have to be ready to change and embrace change and changes in your lives and in your relationships as an avoidant person. How to do that? Well, ask yourself, am I ready to fundamentally change the dynamics in my relationships? And dynamics, by that I mean stop running away, stop quitting, and start to embrace vulnerability and truly showing your emotions openly to another person. And this requires giving up control and power and meeting your partner on an actual equal ground, which can be terrifying for an avoidantly attached person. Now, avoidance must accept to do that their vulnerabilities and need to learn what it means to actually open up emotionally to someone on a safe ground here, of course. Number 2 is dealing with uncomfortable emotions. Well, you have to be prepared to also confront your insecurities and uncomfortable feeling that arise when you start to shift your patterns. And your goal as an avoidant person, therefore, will be that you must stop seeing yourself as always okay and your partner as seeing not okay, because this is usually the fundamental belief of an avoidantly attached person. And therefore, to do that, you have to shift your perspective to a new worldview where you are as well okay as my partner and I am okay. Our emotions are all okay. Our needs are all okay. Again, it's about seeing your partner or meeting your partner on equal ground instead of just hiding, running away, quitting relationships, because it feels too overwhelming. Step by step opening up also for that overwhelm that you're experiencing as an avoidantly attached person. Number 3 is to address triggers in shadow work. When you are in a relationship or you are dating someone and you just want to flee, you just want to run away, stay within that relationship and see that as a chance to identify your triggers and what's difficult for you in that scenario. Often it's also about the version that we don't like about ourselves, like I explained in this episode about the fear of commitment, which is a big one for a avoidantly attached person. We as avoidantly attached people, we don't like ourselves as vulnerable people. We don't like to show ourselves openly. We don't like to express our full spectrum, especially of vulnerable emotions. And this is why we, sometimes feel the impulse to flee and to run away, because we actually try to run away from that version of ourselves that we cannot really hold. It's also important to reflect, of course, on your own behaviors and triggers and not just on your partner's behaviors and triggers. An example for that is that many avoidantly attached people might also unknowingly intensify their partner's clinginess by being too independent. So also understand that your partner, who often is an anxiously attached person, will react with neediness the more room and independence you create for yourself. So the more you run away, often the more they will try to catch you. And therefore, your behavior triggers your partner as well. And your relationship with them will feel even more tight and squeezed the more you try to hide your vulnerabilities and the more you try to escape. So recognizing your own blind spots here as an avoidantly attached person is key. Number 4 is checking your compatibility. Now, once your initial attachment wounds are addressed here in the relationship, evaluate whether you and your partner actually share compatible values and goals. And you have to be super honest in that process here with your partner. So consider aspects like lifestyle, future plans, and also shared standards. Usually qualities that securely attached couples prioritize early on. But maybe you try to push them away because it feels like too much for you and you don't want to commit for a future. Now it's time to actually face those things. And this might be a huge challenge for someone with an avoidant attachment style, but it's absolutely necessary to become feeling comfortable by clarifying a future together. And number 5 is focus on self-healing. So last but not least, it's always easy, as I said before, to blame the other partner of being too clingy, too needy, everything is too much. Shift your focus from blaming your partner to addressing your own flaws. This is what shadow work is actually about, to see your own behaviors, your own triggers, and your part in that relationship dynamic as an avoidantly attached person. Bring your hidden behaviors to light. And now approach number 3, body-based resolution for avoidance-driven symptoms. long term or long sentence to make clear that third one. What is that? What do I mean by that? We also learned on this channel before that trauma is stored within our body. That's for sure. So attachment wounds do appear on a physical level as well as on a psychological level. Both things are important. Usually dysregulation, pressure in your chest, in your throat, in your gut, dissociation, those are typical somatic, so physical symptoms of avoidant attachment. And there are trauma-informed therapy approaches, for example, like thematic experiencing, so SE by Dr. Peter Levine, which come into play here. So we need to work with the body as well and not just do cognitive work, like explained in approach number 1 and 2. So inner child's work and shadow work, those are mainly cognitive focused approaches. But we also need body focused approaches. And this is what we talk about now. Well, body-based resolutions to work through the wounds of an avoidant attachment style, they are when you include the body, and re-regulation tools and resources can be a really good thing for that. You can use, for example, the R3 method that I created, which is based on 3 basic steps in total, and I want to go through those steps with you now. Number 1 is to recognize that the first R on the list, and in order to recognize, you can pause and observe to become aware that you are in a physically dysregulated state. And in that state, you have to describe and write down, that's the first step, your sensations to clear your mind. You can also use the emotional wheel for that again. Step number 2 is to regulate, and there you create a feeling of emotional and physical safety by using various skills and grounding techniques. For me, for example, what's really powerful definitely depends on the situation and the circumstances. But breathing is a powerful technique. When I have the time and capacity, I go for a workout. So I hit the gym, I do sports. When I'm in bed, for example, I'm dysregulated, I try to caress myself. That actually calms me down. It's so interesting how we can use our own bodies to regulate stress. Some people also do that subconsciously. They bite their fingernails or they do this or that. Okay, you see people regulating all the time, but you can also do that consciously. And also co-regulation. Learning to co-regulate, especially as an avoidantly attached person, that's a huge one. Because I couldn't rely on co-regulation early on, now I can practice that. And step number 3 is to reconnect. So acknowledge and align yourself with your thoughts, with your sensations and emotions. And when you want to go through those steps in detail, I definitely recommend you downloading our free workbook where I put down all of those 3 steps, including all the re-regulation resources in detail, and you can download it for free below this video or just go to understandable.net/book. There you can get it and work through it for yourself to learn to re-regulate your nervous system, which is super helpful for an avoidantly attached person to deal with somatic symptoms in particular. Approach number 4 I'd like to talk about today is inner avoidant parts work. Now, working with inner parts is based on approaches like, for example, internal family systems, so IFS therapy, maybe you heard about that one already. And IFS is a therapeutic model that views the mind as made up of different parts, each with its own role, feelings, and desires. So the mind is basically in that model separated. And there are, for example, managers. Those managers, for example, they represent the inner critic, for example. So your inner critic, your inner judge, those are managers. They're also firefighters. And there's also the self at the core of the model. Now, the self is in the IFS model, the central, compassionate, and balanced part of you that you can lead and heal as well. And the goal when working with inner parts is always to build a harmonious relationship between them so you can reduce inner conflict and promote healing for your avoidant attachment wounds. I made an interview about IFS with Ethan Nelson as well on this channel, which I will link to you up here and in the description below. In this video, Ethan guides me through a really quick IFS session, and you can see how the inner parts work. When you use inner parts work for working through avoidant attachment wounds, we also can follow a specific step path here, and I want to present that to you as well. Number one is to identify your protector parts, and these are the part that avoid vulnerability and intimacy usually, and those try to protect you from emotional pain, of course. Recognize those parts first. That's always a really helpful thing. Before you go to number two, and this is where you try to attempt to heal wounded parts of yourself in that model. In this step, you work with parts which carry childhood wounds, like feelings of rejection, for example, or abandonment. And then in step number three, you cultivate self-leadership. And this is done by working with the core self. You can use that core self, which can be guided to approach relationships, for example, with more openness and emotional balance. The core self is also a concept that I kind of use in our pyramid model to strengthen the core self and also the sense of self, how I call it. We have different courses on the top levels, so it's definitely that you use or practice after you already build a huge fundament. So this is why it's level 5 and 6 in our model. And last but not least, approach number 5 here, avoidant attachment repair exercises. And into this category falls everything that directly addresses your avoidant attachment wounds. I also like to call these the practical approaches to attachment wounds. And this one is all about practicing and healing by exposing yourself to what's actually triggering you. So I think it's really effective, but also quite challenging. So you ideally do that and practice that in tiny steps. Repair exercises and practices can be, for example, to express emotions. So you can practice recognizing and naming your emotions regularly, using the emotion wheel, for example. It's a great resource, honestly. You can also journal about your feelings or use emotion charts, for example, that you can use to build awareness, or you share one small emotion with someone you trust. Of course, you need safe relationships for that, even if that feels uncomfortable for you. So it's all about feeling vulnerability and trying to express that and work through that. Work with those parts that you don't like about yourself or where you're scared of in your relationships. We also do that on our courses on our premium platform, as well as to communicate needs. That's the next big thing. Practice identifying your own needs and voicing them in small, low-stakes situations. Good for an avoidant person. You can also use simple, clear language here, and that's easy then, like I need some time to think now, or I feel overwhelmed now and maybe need support. That's a big step for someone with an avoidant attachment style to share that. Remind yourself when you do and practice that expressing needs does not make you a burden, which is always a core belief of an avoidantly attached person. No, you can seek emotional help as well. That's a part of healthy relationships. Setting boundaries is also the next one. Learn to recognize when you're uncomfortable or overwhelmed in relationships. As an avoidantly attached person, you might be quite often overwhelmed. So it's always good to see where there is an actually boundary for you, when it's too much, and maybe you can then get some time for yourself, some space, but don't try to continuously run away. Just try to get some moments to breathe again before you get back into practice. This can be practiced within, especially an intimate relationship, of course. During my first therapy, I didn't have a partner, so I experienced that as quite difficult. My therapist always said, well, you can also practice this in therapy, but from my experience, is best to actually have a partner or to have at least a good friendship where you can practice to communicate boundaries very assertively but yet kindly. For example, like, I need some quiet time right now. I love you. I will be back in an hour or 2 hours, for example. When you practice that, you actually get the feedback, usually in safe relationships, that it's also okay to set that boundary and to communicate those needs. And that's not a bad thing. And most of the times other people, oh yeah, okay, yeah, sure. I also take some time for myself now then. Again, boundaries are a healthy and much needed part of any relationship. And both things, needs and boundaries, are very important to communicate. And those things can be practiced, of course, in our premium courses on level 2, 3, and 4 of our pyramid model. So in case you want to attempt those courses, you can get access now at understandable.net/join. And I see you there in our premium community. Let's talk about other practices as well here in this 5th approach. And there's, for example, safe dependency practice. There's also something that's particular for a avoidantly attached person, a really good thing. You can learn to gradually allow yourself to depend on others in small, manageable ways. For example, you can ask a friend for help with a minor task or advice on a decision. You can also reflect on the experience to challenge beliefs that dependency leads to rejection quite often. And I have to remind myself quite often to do that again. For example, when I need something or I need to make a decision, I usually just try to find a solution on my own. That's what's intuitively for me as an avoidantly attached person. But what's really interesting here is that when I ask others for help or advice or their opinion, it usually also makes my own life better. And it also makes their life better because they feel, oh yeah, I did something good, I helped Robert, that's a nice thing. It gives them a good feeling as well. Okay, we also have co-regulation activities, and those are often, as I said, challenging for avoidantly attached people because it's often the opposite of intuitive or familiar for people with an avoidant attachment style, because that was never an option for them. So co-regulating, relying on other people emotionally. Now, you can practice being emotionally present with others, for example, during calm moments, when you try to fall asleep, when you're laying next to your partner. That's the perfect moment to practice vulnerability, in my opinion. Now, these were 5 ways to work through an avoidant attachment style. Definitely let me know if you have tried some of them or if you have tried other ways as well. Let me know in the comments below. And now I'm curious what you think about those 5 ways. Also, let me know. And if you want to support the podcast, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Subscribe here on YouTube. And I see you next time for another episode here on the channel. Have a great day.